Sir, people like you don't belong here. These cars are not for someone in your situation. The sales manager's voice rang out across the pristine showroom, sharp and cold, stopping conversations mid-sentence and drawing the stunned attention of everyone within earshot. Before I tell you what happened next in this luxury dealership, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, subscribe, and hit like, because what happened here will leave you speechless. Marcus Langston walked through the glass doors of Elite Autos, Miami's most prestigious luxury car dealership, his worn navy t-shirt, faded cargo shorts, and scuffed sneakers standing in stark contrast to the polished perfection of the showroom, gleaming sedans, sleek coupes, and towering SUVs sat beneath dazzling LED lights, their price tags stretching from $15,000 to over $1.2 million. But Marcus wasn't here to admire the cars. 2 weeks earlier, he had purchased this entire dealership for $15 million. Today, though, he wasn't Marcus the owner. He came disguised as an ordinary customer, determined to see how his employees treated people who didn't look wealthy. Rumors had been swirling on X about Elite Auto's reputation for exclusivity and bias. Claims that some customers were ignored while others were quietly judged by appearance alone. Marcus wanted to see the truth with his own eyes, so he parked his 2018 Honda CR-V far from the entrance, dressed simply, and stepped inside to test the culture he had just inherited. The shift in energy was immediate. Conversations dipped, laughter softened, and subtle glances followed him as he moved further into the showroom. 3 employees near a $25,000 convertible exchanged quick looks and faint smirks, their quiet whispers barely masked. Marcus noticed every detail but kept his expression calm, his pace unhurried. Then Karen Whitaker, the 45-year-old sales manager, approached him. In her gray tailored suit, heels clicking softly on the showroom floor, and blonde hair pinned neatly back, she carried herself with practiced authority, but her sharp green eyes revealed more than professionalism. They revealed judgment. "Hello," Karen said smoothly, her tone polite but distant. "Are you here to browse? Or—" Her gaze traveled slowly from his sneakers up to his face. Calculating. Marcus smiled faintly and nodded, just looking around. Karen's lips curved into a tight, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We specialize in high-end vehicles here," she said softly but deliberately. "Perhaps I can suggest something more affordable for you." Her words, carefully chosen, carried an edge that wasn't lost on Marcus. But he didn't react. He'd heard words like these before. Instead, he kept his voice even and replied, "Mind if I take a look?" Before Karen could answer, a young salesman stepped forward, Jamal Carter, just 25 years old and one of the few black employees on the floor, smiled warmly and gestured toward the lineup of cars. "I can show you our top models," he offered sincerely, his tone welcoming. But before Marcus could respond, Karen's sharp voice cut him off. "Jamal, handle the delivery paperwork. I'll take care of this," she ordered without looking at him. Jamal froze for a moment, the warmth fading from his expression, and his gaze flicked to Marcus briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Before he stepped back reluctantly, Karen turned her attention back to Marcus, her tone clipped and controlled. "Do you have something specific in mind today? Just so you know, we have strict policies about touching the vehicles unless you're pre-qualified." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but firm. "Pre-qualified? You're saying I need that before I can even look?" Karen nodded, her smile fixed in place. "I'm just trying to save you time. These cars aren't for everyone." That's when Victor Hayes entered, and the atmosphere shifted again. At 50, Victor, the regional director, carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed his word was law. His $5,000 Italian suit, slicked back salt and pepper hair, and gleaming watch all screamed authority. but his expression, as his sharp gray eyes landed on Marcus, carried something colder. Dismissal. "Karen," Victor asked curtly. "Who's this?" "Just a walk-in," she replied quickly. Victor stepped closer, studying Marcus from head to toe, his smirk widening faintly. "Sir, we have certain standards here. If you're not pre-qualified, I'd suggest you try a dealership with cars under $3,000. Marcus met his gaze steadily, his voice level. "You're assuming I'm not qualified?" Victor gave a low, humorless laugh. "Don't take it personally. We value efficiency here." Marcus's calm never wavered. He stepped closer to a sleek $300,000 SUV, gently brushing his fingertips against the door frame. But Victor's voice cut sharply through the air. "Please don't touch the merchandise." The command was loud enough to make nearby conversations stop altogether, employees freezing in place as the silence thickened. Marcus slowly pulled his hand back, his face unreadable, his tone soft but deliberate. "Interesting way to welcome potential buyers," he said calmly. "What if I told you I was here to buy?" Victor chuckled, colder this time, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Let's be realistic," he said flatly. "These aren't the kinds of cars people like you just walk in and buy." The words hung heavy in the air, striking harder than the silence that followed. Karen shifted uncomfortably. Jamal stood frozen mid-step, and the other employees busied themselves with fake tasks while keeping their ears sharp, pretending not to watch but catching every word. Marcus stood perfectly still, absorbing it all, his memories flashing back to moments from his childhood, his mother being turned away from businesses, doors closing before she even spoke, people judging her before they knew her. But Marcus was no longer powerless, and this time would be different, keeping his composure. His voice stayed calm, almost too calm for the tension in the room. "That's an interesting assumption," he said evenly, his gaze fixed on Victor. "I'd like to speak to the owner." Karen blinked, startled, exchanging a nervous glance with Victor, who folded his arms across his chest, his smirk returning as if savoring the moment. "The owner doesn't meet with just anyone," Victor replied flatly. Marcus didn't look away, his expression unchanging, his voice low but firm. "I think this time," he said, each word deliberate. "He'll want to," and as the weight of his words settled over the silent showroom, Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, his calm exterior concealing the storm he was about to unleash on Elite Autos. Victor's sharp gaze lingered on Marcus, his smirk still carved into place, but the tension in the room was shifting like pressure before a storm. Thick and suffocating. "Sir, I've already explained," Victor said slowly, his voice deliberately loud so everyone nearby could hear. "We have policies in place to ensure only qualified buyers receive our time and attention. This isn't a place where just anyone walks in off the street expecting a test drive." Karen nodded quickly beside him, clutching her clipboard like a shield, her discomfort visible now as she sensed the weight of Marcus's silence. Jamal, standing off to the side, fidgeted nervously with the delivery forms in his hands, watching Marcus closely while pretending to shuffle paperwork. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, almost quiet enough to make everyone lean in. "You keep talking about who qualifies and who doesn't, but you've never asked me a single question. Not my name, not what I want, not what I can afford. You've already decided who I am." Karen flinched slightly at his words, but Victor only folded his arms tighter, his arrogance radiating. "Sir, this is a high-end dealership," Victor replied smoothly, his tone edged with condescension. "We deal with serious clients here, celebrities, executives, investors, people who understand the value of what we offer. Now, unless you have proof you belong in that category, I'll kindly ask you not to waste my team's time." The word "belong" hung heavy in the air, like a blade balanced on the edge of a table, threatening to fall. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Victor like a chess opponent making his next move. "Interesting," Marcus said evenly, "because I thought this was a place where people came to buy cars, not be judged on whether they belong." His tone wasn't raised, but its calm precision cut sharper than shouting ever could, and several employees froze where they stood, sensing something they couldn't quite name, before Victor could respond. Karen tried to interject, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Sir, maybe you misunderstood. We just have to be cautious with our inventory. That's all. These vehicles require pre-qualification paperwork. And it's—" "Stop," Marcus interrupted gently, his gaze shifting to her, his tone measured but firm. "You assumed I couldn't afford to be here before I even said a word. That's not caution. Karen, that's judgment." Karen swallowed hard, unable to meet his eyes, and Jamal shifted uncomfortably in the background, his fists tightening slightly at his sides. Victor, sensing Karen's hesitation, stepped forward, his presence towering as he deliberately invaded Marcus's space. "Look," he said coldly, lowering his voice so only Marcus could hear. "You might have had a good run wherever you came from. But here, we have a certain image to maintain. Our clients expect a standard, and I have to protect that." Marcus held his gaze, unblinking. "An image?" he asked softly, his voice dropping lower, forcing Victor to lean in to hear him. "Or a prejudice?" The quiet power behind the question made Victor stiffen, his confident smirk faltering for the first time. He opened his mouth to respond, but Jamal suddenly stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. "Mr. Hayes," Jamal began carefully, his voice respectful but steady. "Maybe we should let him take a look. We can at least hear what he's looking for." Karen shot Jamal a warning glare, but Marcus caught the flicker of defiance in Jamal's eyes and filed it away silently. This young man, he thought, understood more than anyone else in this room right now. Victor turned his head slowly toward Jamal, his expression hardening. "Thank you, Jamal. But I think I can handle this," he said curtly, dismissing him with a flick of his hand. Jamal clenched his jaw and stepped back, frustration written across his face, but he said nothing further. Marcus took a slow breath, his patience razor-thin but controlled. When the sound of heels clicking against polished tile cut through the tense silence, every head turned as Elena Martinez, the 40-year-old regional operations manager, strode confidently into the showroom, her charcoal blazer perfectly fitted, her expression composed but sharp, her presence commanding immediate respect. She scanned the room quickly, sensing the thick tension as she walked directly toward Marcus, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "Mr. Langston," she said warmly, her voice rich with authority. "I'm sorry I'm late. Traffic was brutal." The entire showroom froze. Karen blinked rapidly, her clipboard slipping slightly from her grasp, while Jamal's eyes widened, his mouth parting in shock. Victor turned slowly toward Elena, his brows knitting together as her words sank in, confusion flashing briefly before his features hardened into something darker. Realization. "Mr. Langston," Karen repeated faintly, her voice barely above a whisper, her face paling as though the air had been sucked from the room. Elena turned her sharp gaze toward Karen and Victor, her tone suddenly formal and cool. "Yes, Karen," she said deliberately, her voice carrying across the silent showroom. "This is Marcus Langston, the new owner of Elite Autos." The words landed like a thunderclap, shattering the carefully constructed hierarchy of the room in an instant. Gasps rippled softly among the employees, some exchanging wide-eyed looks, others lowering their heads to hide their expressions. Victor's smirk vanished completely, his jaw tightening as he took a sharp step back, his arms falling loosely to his sides, his perfectly controlled facade cracking under the weight of Elena's announcement. Karen stammered, struggling to find her words. I didn't know. Mr. Langston. I thought. Marcus raised a hand slightly, stopping her mid-sentence, his calmness chilling in contrast to the chaos now erupting silently around them. You thought I didn't belong here, he said evenly, his voice steady but layered with meaning. And that's exactly why I came. He shifted his gaze slowly from Karen to Victor, his eyes unblinking, his presence commanding without effort. I wanted to see how my staff treats people who don't fit the image of your ideal client. And now, he paused deliberately, letting the weight of his words settle. I have my answer. Victor's fists clenched tightly at his sides, his knuckles whitening, his pride warring with his fear as the truth unraveled before him. He drew in a shaky breath, forcing a strained smile as he tried to recover his composure. Mr. Langston, he began carefully, his voice low and measured. I had no idea. There must have been some misunderstanding. Marcus's expression remained impassive, his tone cutting and calm. The misunderstanding, he said quietly, is believing this dealership thrives on exclusion instead of respect. The silence stretched painfully as employees stood frozen, their earlier judgment now hanging heavy in the air. And Jamal, watching from the side, felt a quiet spark ignite within him. Hope that this was the beginning of something different. Victor finally exhaled sharply, adjusting his cufflinks as though trying to regain control, but Marcus's unwavering stare made it clear where the balance of power now lay. Elena stepped closer to Marcus, her voice low but firm. Would you like me to gather the staff? Marcus nodded once, his voice steady, his authority absolute. Yes, he said calmly, his gaze still locked on Victor. It's time we have a conversation about what kind of business this is going to be. The unspoken promise in his tone sent a ripple of unease across the room. And as Elena moved to organize the meeting, Marcus took one last glance around the silent showroom, memorizing every face, every expression, every moment of discomfort etched into this place he now owned. The glass walls of the Elite Autos conference room reflected the tension simmering in the air as the staff filed in, their expressions a mixture of nervousness, shame, and quiet curiosity. Some clutched their clipboards tightly, others avoided eye contact entirely. And in the center of it all sat Marcus Langston at the head of the polished mahogany table, his calm composure masking the storm beneath the surface. Victor Hayes took a seat at the far end, his jaw tight, his posture rigid, his confidence fractured but not entirely gone, while Karen Whitaker slid into the chair beside him, pale and fidgeting, twisting her pen between trembling fingers. Jamal Carter, on the other hand, sat straighter than he ever had before, his young face serious, his eyes darting between Marcus and the rest of the room, sensing instinctively that this was a turning point, not just for the dealership, but for everyone in it. Elena Martinez stood near the door, her tablet in hand, her expression controlled and sharp, silently observing every reaction, every whispered exchange. Marcus didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his gaze moving slowly from one employee to the next, giving each person the weight of being seen, really seen, before he finally leaned forward and rested his hands on the table. I came here today, he began, his voice calm but firm, carrying easily through the hushed room, to understand how this dealership operates, how my employees treat the people who walk through our doors. What I experienced tells me we have a serious problem. His eyes shifted deliberately toward Victor, locking onto him without blinking. And it starts with leadership. A ripple of tension moved across the room as Victor straightened in his seat, forcing a tight, measured smile. With all due respect. Mr. Langston, he said carefully, his voice smooth but layered with quiet defiance. Elite Autos has thrived for years under my management. We've cultivated a very specific clientele, celebrities, athletes, CEOs, people who represent the brand's value. That exclusivity is part of our success. Marcus's brow lifted slightly, his tone sharpening. Though his volume never rose, exclusivity is one thing. Victor, disrespect is another. What I saw today wasn't exclusivity. It was assumption. It was judgment. It was prejudice. Victor bristled, shifting forward in his chair, his pride flashing in his eyes. I wasn't prejudiced, he countered quickly, glancing toward the others as though seeking silent agreement. I was protecting the dealership's image. That's my job. Marcus leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, his voice steady but edged with cold precision. Your job is to protect the business, not your ego. And protecting this business means respecting every person who steps inside, regardless of what they're wearing, what they drive, or what you think they can afford. A murmur moved through the room as a few employees glanced at one another, their unease growing, some nodding subtly, others still too cautious to react. Karen cleared her throat softly, speaking for the first time, her voice small and tentative. Mr. Langston, I want to apologize for earlier, she said, her words halting. I made assumptions I shouldn't have, and I realize now how wrong that was. Marcus turned his gaze to her, his tone softening slightly but still resolute. Acknowledging it is a start. Karen, he said quietly, but apologies without action don't change culture. Jamal spoke up next, his voice measured but stronger than before. I've seen this happen before, he said, his eyes shifting between Marcus and Victor. Not just today, but other times. Customers walking out because they felt unwelcome. I've tried to say something, but... He hesitated, glancing briefly at Victor, whose stiff posture answered the unspoken truth. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze softening toward Jamal, admiration flickering briefly in his expression. Thank you for speaking up. Jamal, he said firmly, his voice carrying weight. That takes courage. Then he turned his attention back to the room, his tone deepening, commanding attention. From this moment forward, things will change at Elite Autos. We are no longer a dealership that judges customers by appearance. We will be known for excellence in service, not arrogance. Every single person who walks through that door will be treated with respect, whether they're wearing a tailored suit or sweatpants, whether they drive a Bentley or a 10-year-old Honda. Victor scoffed softly under his breath, his frustration finally breaking through his carefully managed facade. And Marcus's sharp gaze snapped to him instantly. Something funny. Victor? Marcus asked evenly, his voice deceptively calm. Victor hesitated, then shook his head, though his lips remained pressed into a thin, angry line. No, sir, he muttered, but the defiance in his tone betrayed him. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower, the authority in his words unshakable. This isn't a suggestion. It's not open to debate. This is my dealership now, and this is how we will operate. He let the silence hang for a beat before continuing, his tone leveling into something measured and deliberate. We'll be implementing mandatory bias and inclusion training for every employee. Starting next week, customer service protocols will be rewritten. And let me be perfectly clear, there will be zero tolerance for discrimination moving forward. The weight of his words settled heavily over the table, and for the first time, Victor's confidence faltered visibly, his eyes narrowing as he exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of his chair. Karen lowered her gaze to the table, nodding faintly, her expression thoughtful, as if confronting uncomfortable truths she'd ignored for years. Jamal, sitting straighter now, felt hope stirring inside him, though he kept his composure tightly controlled. Elena, still silent by the door, studied every face, committing reactions to memory, her mind already calculating the steps needed to reshape the culture. Mr. Langston. Victor began again finally, his voice quieter, forced into diplomacy now. I understand your perspective, but this approach could alienate some of our existing clients, people who expect a certain environment. Marcus's gaze hardened, his words deliberate and cold. If our clients expect us to disrespect others, then they're not the clients we want. The sentence struck like a hammer, reverberating through the silent room, and for the first time since Marcus arrived, Victor had no response. He leaned back slowly in his chair, his jaw tight, his knuckles pale against the armrest. Marcus scanned the room one last time, his voice softening but not losing strength. I didn't build my life by judging people based on where they come from, what they wear, or what they drive, he said, his tone steady and controlled. I built it by respecting everyone, by listening, by giving people chances others wouldn't. That's how we succeed, not by building walls, but by opening doors. A quiet stillness filled the conference room, the weight of Marcus's words sinking deep, shifting something intangible in the atmosphere. For the first time, several employees nodded openly, their expressions thoughtful, even relieved, as though they'd been waiting for someone to finally say aloud what they'd silently felt for years. Jamal exhaled slowly, the corners of his mouth twitching into the faintest hint of a smile, while Karen wiped at the corner of her eye discreetly, her polished composure beginning to crumble under the weight of realization. Victor sat rigid, silent, his pride bruised, but his position suddenly uncertain, and as Marcus leaned back in his chair, hands folded loosely in front of him, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had nothing left to prove. This is the beginning, he said calmly, his gaze sweeping across the table. From today forward, Elite Autos is going to be different, better. You'll either be part of that change, or you won't be here. The words landed with finality, leaving no room for argument, and in the silence that followed, the dealership's future shifted beneath their feet. The conference room was silent, the weight of Marcus's last words lingering in the air like thunder after lightning. But beneath that silence, tension simmered, ready to boil over. Victor Hayes sat rigid at the far end of the table, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling with shallow, controlled breaths, while Marcus Langston remained seated at the head, calm and composed, his authority filling the glass-walled space without effort. Elena Martinez leaned casually against the doorframe, tablet in hand, her sharp eyes darting between faces, cataloging every twitch and flicker of expression, while Karen Whitaker sat beside Victor, pale and uneasy, fiddling with her pen as though it were a lifeline, and Jamal Carter sat forward slightly, shoulders squared, silent but attentive, sensing this was the moment where everything would change. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the polished mahogany table, his hands clasped loosely, his voice quiet but commanding enough to draw every eye back to him. I came here today to test this dealership, he began, each word measured, deliberate, to understand how the people I've entrusted with my business treat the people who walk through these doors. What I saw told me more than any financial report ever could. His gaze locked on Victor, unblinking, unyielding, and you, Victor, made something very clear to me. Victor stiffened, lifting his chin defiantly. With all due respect. Mr. Langston, he said, his voice sharp but steady. Elite Autos has thrived under my leadership because of the standards I've maintained. This isn't a charity, it's a luxury dealership. The exclusivity of this brand is why we generate $12 million a year. Marcus's jaw flexed slightly, but his tone remained even, calm as still water hiding a current beneath. Exclusivity isn't the problem, he said softly. It's how you've used it as a shield, an excuse to judge people before they even speak. He let the silence hang for a beat, his voice deepening as he continued. Today, I walked into my own showroom dressed like any other customer, and you decided who I was based on what I wore, what I drove, and what you assumed I could afford. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her cheeks flushed, but Victor pressed forward, his pride bristling, refusing to back down. I made an evaluation based on experience, he argued, his voice rising slightly. You have to understand, Mr. Langston, people come here all the time just to look, to waste our time, to take pictures next to cars they'll never buy. My job is to filter out the ones who aren't serious. Marcus's gaze hardened, his voice dropping lower, steadier, each word slicing cleanly through the room. No, Victor. Your job is to lead this team, to uphold this dealership's reputation, and to ensure every single person who walks into this place leaves with respect, whether they buy a car or not. Jamal's head tilted slightly, his young face unreadable, but his eyes burned with quiet validation. Karen's grip on her pen faltered, her hand lowering slowly onto the table, her shame unspoken but visible. Victor's fingers drummed against the tabletop, his mask of composure cracking as his frustration bled through. With all due respect, "Sir," he said tightly, "you don't know this business the way I do. You can't just come in here and—" Marcus's voice cut across his like steel against stone, calm but immovable. "I know this business better than you think," he said, his tone razor-sharp now, "because I know what it's like to stand where your customers stand. I've walked into rooms where people looked me up and down and decided my worth before I opened my mouth. I've been ignored, dismissed, underestimated. And I built everything I have today by refusing to let people like you define me." Victor froze, his mouth opening slightly but no words coming out, the weight of Marcus's statement crashing down like a hammer in the silent room. Elena stepped forward slightly, her voice smooth but firm, cutting through the thick tension. "Victor," she said crisply, "the reality is this. Mr. Langston owns Elite Autos. That means the standards, the culture, the expectations. They come from him now. It's time to adapt." Victor turned sharply toward her, his pride wounded, his jaw tightening, but her steady gaze held him in place, unyielding. Karen cleared her throat softly, her voice tentative. "Careful." "Mr. Langston," she said, glancing nervously between the two men. I need to say something." Marcus turned his attention toward her, his expression softening just slightly, giving her room to speak. "I handled things wrong today," she admitted quietly, her voice breaking slightly at the edges. "I judged you. I judged others. And it wasn't fair." She glanced briefly toward Jamal, her guilt flashing in her eyes before she looked back at Marcus. "I want to do better," she said simply. Marcus studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before nodding slowly. Acknowledging it is the first step. He said softly but firmly, "Now prove it with action." Karen nodded quickly, her relief almost visible. But Victor shifted in his chair, his fingers curling tightly into fists, his pride refusing to surrender. "Mr. Langston." He began carefully, his voice low and deliberate. "I've given 20 years of my life to this place. I've built the relationships. I've driven the revenue. I've protected this dealership's name. You can't just walk in and tear all that down." Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his voice dropping lower, quiet but commanding, forcing Victor to listen. "I'm not tearing it down. Victor," he said steadily, "I'm building it better. The question is whether you're going to be part of that, or not? The words hung in the air like a verdict, final and unshakable, and the silence that followed was broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Jamal's chest rose and fell with quiet anticipation, his wide, alert eyes fixed on Victor, while Elena's sharp gaze tracked every flicker of emotion crossing his face. Victor inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring slightly, his shoulders squared as he stared back at Marcus, trying to hold on to the last fragments of his authority. "And if I disagree?" he asked finally, his tone measured but brittle. Marcus didn't blink. "Then you can step aside," he said simply, his voice even, unshaken. "I won't let your pride cost this dealership its future." The quiet force behind his words rippled through the room, and Victor felt it, the power dynamic shifting, the ground beneath him tilting with finality. Karen exhaled shakily, lowering her eyes, while Jamal's lips curved just slightly into the faintest hint of a smile, hope flickering in his expression. Elena glanced down at her tablet, tapping notes deliberately, as though setting plans in motion already. Victor sat back slowly, his silence saying more than his words ever could, his jaw tight, his pride battered but intact. Marcus rose slowly from his chair, straightening his shoulders, his presence filling the space with quiet authority as he spoke one last time, his voice firm, his resolve absolute. "This isn't just about selling cars," he said, his gaze sweeping across the entire room, holding every pair of eyes in place. "This is about respect, dignity, and the kind of business we choose to be. From this day forward, Elite Autos will stand for inclusion, for fairness, and for excellence, not arrogance. That's the future, and I expect every one of you to decide whether you're part of it." He let the silence settle for a long moment, his words sinking deep, reshaping the air itself, before finally turning and walking toward the door, Elena falling into step behind him, Jamal rising instinctively as though ready to follow, and Karen sitting quietly in her chair, staring down at her trembling hands, while Victor remained frozen, his thoughts a storm of anger, fear, and dawning realization that his reign was over, though he wasn't ready to accept it yet. The next morning. The glass-paneled showroom of Elite Autos gleamed under the soft Miami sunlight. But inside the conference room, the atmosphere was far from bright. The entire staff had been summoned to an all-hands meeting, and now every seat was filled, every conversation hushed, every pair of eyes shifting uneasily toward the head of the polished mahogany table where Marcus Langston stood, calm but commanding, ready to define the future of his dealership. Elena Martinez stood beside him, tablet in hand, her poised confidence setting the tone, while Jamal Carter sat near the front, shoulders squared, his expression resolute, and Karen Whitaker sat toward the side, hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture small but her gaze attentive, the shame from yesterday still lingering in her eyes. At the far end of the table, Victor Hayes leaned back stiffly in his chair, his jaw tight, arms folded across his chest, his expression carefully composed but his tension palpable, every muscle in his face locked as though bracing for impact. Marcus scanned the room slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone lean forward instinctively, waiting for his words. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet power that filled the space without force. "I bought Elite Autos," he began, his tone measured but resonant, "because I saw potential, not just in the numbers, but in the people who work here, in the customers who trust us, and in the brand's reputation for quality. But what I experienced yesterday made something painfully clear. We are not living up to that potential." He paused, letting his words settle like weight on the room, his gaze steady as it moved deliberately across the table, locking briefly on Victor before continuing. "When I walked into this showroom yesterday, dressed like any other customer, I wasn't treated like someone you wanted to help. I wasn't treated like someone you valued. I was judged, dismissed, and in some cases, insulted. Not because of who I am, but because of who you assumed I was. That, he said firmly, his voice tightening slightly, is unacceptable. A quiet ripple passed through the room. Some employees lowered their gazes, while others exchanged uneasy glances, the uncomfortable truth of his words settling heavily between them. Marcus stepped forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the table, his tone softening but carrying no less authority. I want you to hear me clearly. This ends today. From this moment on, Elite Autos will not be known as a place where people are judged by what they wear, what they drive, or what they look like. We will be known for respect, for inclusion, and for providing an exceptional experience to everyone who walks through our doors. He turned toward Elena, who tapped her tablet and brought up a set of updated protocols on the conference room screen. Starting next week, we are implementing new customer service standards. Marcus continued. Every guest will be greeted and treated with dignity, without exception. Every inquiry will be respected, no matter how large or small. We're also introducing mandatory training, not optional, focused on bias, inclusion, and customer engagement. If we're going to succeed, every single one of us has to understand that how we make people feel is just as important as what we sell. Jamal raised his hand slightly, his voice steady but sincere when Marcus nodded to him. I've seen people walk out, he said carefully, glancing briefly toward Victor before continuing. They came in excited, ready to buy, but they left angry or embarrassed because they didn't feel welcome. I want to be proud of this place, and I think this is the right step. A few employees nodded quietly in agreement, their confidence emboldened by Jamal's words. But Victor shifted forward suddenly, his voice low but cutting through the growing current of optimism. With all due respect, he said sharply, Elite Autos has a brand to protect. Our clients, the ones who buy six-figure vehicles, expect exclusivity. If we start treating every walk-in like a VIP, we risk alienating the very people who make this dealership successful. Marcus turned slowly toward him, his gaze steady, his voice quiet but piercing in its precision. Victor, he said calmly, our success doesn't come from making a few people feel important while dismissing everyone else. Our success comes from building trust. The moment we make someone feel less than because they don't fit our image, we've failed. Not just them, but ourselves. Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond, his silence louder than any argument. Marcus took a slow breath, shifting his attention back to the team, his tone deepening, carrying both resolve and hope. I didn't grow up with privilege, he said plainly, his voice steady but threaded with quiet emotion. I know what it feels like to walk into places like this and be treated as though you don't belong. I've lived that. And I built my business on the belief that no one should ever have to feel invisible. That's the culture I want here, one where every person who walks through our doors feels seen, valued, and respected. Karen inhaled softly, her hands clasped tighter, and for the first time, she spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. Mr. Langston, she said carefully, I want to do better. Yesterday was a wake-up call for me, and I know I have to earn back trust. Yours, the team's, and our customers. I'm committed to making that change. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression softening as he regarded her. I believe in second chances. Karen, he said firmly, his tone carrying weight, but second chances require action. Prove it. She nodded quickly, relief flickering briefly across her features before she settled back in her chair. Elena stepped forward then, her voice calm but decisive. We'll also be introducing performance reviews tied directly to customer experience, she announced, scrolling through her tablet. That means bonuses, promotions, and advancement will now depend not just on sales numbers, but on service quality and client feedback. We're setting a higher standard. Several employees shifted uncomfortably, but Jamal smiled faintly, sitting taller, his pride quiet but visible. Victor, however, leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the polished wood, his silence now laced with quiet resistance, though he masked it beneath a composed facade. Marcus noticed but didn't address it, choosing instead to focus on the team as a whole. "This isn't going to be easy," he admitted honestly, his tone grounded, authentic. "Changing culture never is. But this dealership is going to succeed, not by clinging to outdated ideas, but by leading the way forward. We will become a place where excellence and inclusion live side by side, where our reputation isn't just about what we sell, but about who we are." He let the words sink in, his gaze sweeping slowly across the room, locking briefly on each employee, as though imprinting the vision into the very foundation of the team. "This is our chance to rebuild, to become something better than we were before," Marcus finished, his voice deep and steady. "And every one of you has a role in making that happen." The silence that followed was profound, different from the tension-filled quiet of yesterday. This silence was thoughtful, heavy with possibility, tinged with hope. Jamal nodded subtly, his expression determined, while Karen wiped discreetly at the corner of her eye, and Elena stood poised beside Marcus, already planning the first steps of transformation. Victor, though silent, lowered his gaze briefly, his jaw locked, his mind clearly turning over unspoken thoughts. Marcus leaned back slightly, his hands resting calmly on the table, his presence commanding without effort as he delivered his final words of the meeting. "This is the beginning of a new chapter for Elite Autos," he said firmly, his tone resolute. "We will be better. We will lead by example. And we will prove that success built on respect lasts longer than any shortcut built on arrogance." As the meeting ended and the team slowly dispersed, the energy in the room shifted, some faces lit with cautious optimism, others shadowed with doubt, and one, seated at the far end, still clouded with quiet defiance. Victor's silence was louder than his words, and though he rose without a protest, the glint in his eyes carried a promise. This battle wasn't over yet. The afternoon sun bathed the Elite Autos showroom in a warm glow, but inside the glass-walled conference room, the air felt heavier than ever. Marcus Langston stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, hands resting lightly on the surface, his calm presence commanding the entire room, while Victor Hayes sat at the far end, his expression tight and unreadable, his fingers drumming slowly against the wood as if marking time before a storm. The meeting had just ended, but Victor hadn't moved, his rigid posture radiating defiance, and Marcus could sense the resistance before a single word was spoken. Elena Martinez stood near the door, arms folded, her sharp eyes locked on Victor, ready for whatever came next, while Jamal Carter lingered nearby, hesitant to leave, sensing instinctively that something critical was about to unfold. Karen Whitaker remained seated off to the side, her hands folded nervously in her lap, her gaze shifting between the two men, the tension tightening around her like a vice. Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice calm but deliberate, each word measured with precision. "Victor," he said evenly, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You've been quiet since this morning, but I can see exactly what's on your mind. So, let's not waste time. If you have something to say, now's the moment." Victor leaned forward slowly, resting his forearms on the table, his fingers interlaced tightly, his sharp gray eyes locking on Marcus with a cold intensity. "I've given this dealership 20 years of my life," he began, his voice low but edged with steel. And now, in a matter of days, you've decided to rewrite everything that made it successful. You think you can walk in here, throw around your authority, and change the rules? You don't understand how this business works. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but his tone stayed controlled, deliberate, his voice steady as stone. I understand more than you think, he replied softly. I understand exactly what this business is supposed to represent. Quality, service, respect. And what I saw yesterday tells me we've lost our way. Victor's laugh was low, humorless, laced with frustration. Respect doesn't sell cars. Marcus, exclusivity does. That's why our clients come here. That's why they spend 6 figures without blinking. They don't want to sit next to someone who looks like they can't afford the tires on these cars. That's reality. Marcus straightened slowly, his full height commanding the room as his voice deepened. Sharp, but calm, cutting through the air like a blade. The only reality here, he said firmly, is that you've been running this dealership like your personal kingdom, deciding who's worthy and who isn't. And in the process, you've cost us customers, revenue, and our reputation. That ends today. A ripple of unease passed through the room as Karen's breath caught softly, her gaze lowering to the table, while Jamal's jaw clenched tightly, his quiet anger barely contained, his loyalty to Marcus solidifying with every word. Victor, however, leaned back in his chair, forcing a thin smile, masking his bruised pride behind practiced arrogance. You think you can build a luxury brand by catering to everyone? He asked, his voice low but cutting. You'll turn this dealership into a circus. The people who matter, the ones with real money, they'll walk. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone dropping lower, steady and deliberate, each word sharp as glass. If the people who matter to you are the ones who only feel important when others are excluded, then they aren't the people who matter to me. The sentence struck the room like a hammer, and for a moment, silence settled over the space, heavy and unbroken, until Elena stepped forward, her voice crisp and clear. Victor, she said firmly, her gaze unwavering. You need to hear what Marcus is saying. This isn't about abandoning the brand. It's about strengthening it. Respect doesn't cheapen excellence. It elevates it. Victor shot her a sharp look, his frustration flashing, but Elena held her ground, her calm authority unshaken. With all due respect. Elena, he said tightly, you don't understand the clients I've spent 2 decades cultivating. No, Marcus interjected suddenly, his voice low but commanding, his presence filling the space like a storm rolling in. I understand them better than you think. Victor, I've sat in their boardrooms. I've built partnerships with the same executives you're so desperate to impress. And here's what I've learned. People with real power, real influence, real money. They value being treated with respect. But they also respect businesses that treat everyone with dignity. Victor stared at him, his jaw tight, his silence more telling than words. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his tone dropping to a quiet, controlled force that drew the entire room closer without realizing it. I didn't buy this dealership to maintain your status quo, he said, his voice steady but edged with quiet authority. I bought it to build something better, something lasting, and you, Victor, have a choice to make. Victor's brow furrowed slightly, his voice lower now, quieter but laced with warning. A choice? Marcus nodded once, his gaze locked firmly on him, unblinking. You can choose to adapt and lead this team into the future, he said clearly, or you can step aside and make room for someone who will. The words hung in the air, final and sharp. As the tension reached its peak, Karen drew in a sharp breath, her pen falling from her hand onto the table with a soft click. While Jamal's eyes widened slightly, the weight of Marcus's ultimatum sinking deep into the room. Victor's nostrils flared slightly, his shoulders squaring, his pride warring with his instinct for self-preservation. "And if I don't?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but heavy with threat. Marcus didn't blink. "Then I'll make that decision for you," he said calmly, his tone like tempered steel, controlled but unyielding. "I will not allow this dealership to be held hostage by anyone's ego, not even yours." For a moment, no one breathed. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade beneath the weight of Marcus's words. Victor's gaze dropped briefly, his jaw tightening, before he looked up again, masking his retreat with a thin, practiced smile that fooled no one. "Understood," he said quietly, though his tone carried a promise unspoken, one Marcus caught instantly. Elena's sharp eyes narrowed, sensing the silent battle beneath Victor's composed facade. But she said nothing, only taking mental note as Marcus stepped back slightly, his voice steady but resolute as he addressed the room one last time. "Elite Autos will not be divided," he said firmly, his gaze sweeping across every face. "This is a new era. If you're with me, we're going to build something we can all be proud of. If you're not, you need to decide that now." His words carried no anger, only certainty, and the room felt the shift as clearly as the Miami heat pressing against the glass walls outside. Jamal nodded slowly, his quiet support unspoken but obvious. Karen exhaled shakily, as though relieved to finally see a path forward, and Elena placed her tablet against her chest, her expression steady but determined, already preparing for what came next. Victor leaned back in his chair, silent, his arms crossed loosely as his gaze drifted toward the window, the glint in his eyes betraying the storm still brewing beneath his surface, calm. Marcus knew this wasn't over, not yet, but the balance of power had shifted, and for the first time since he walked into Elite Autos, the future felt firmly in his hands. The following week, the atmosphere inside Elite Autos felt transformed, yet the weight of anticipation still hung in the air. The towering glass showroom gleamed under the Miami sun, reflecting rows of polished luxury vehicles. But it wasn't the cars that held everyone's attention. It was the man standing at the center of it all. Marcus Langston faced his entire team, his calm presence commanding without effort, his gaze steady as he prepared to close one chapter and open another. Elena Martinez stood beside him, tablet in hand, her composed stance radiating quiet authority, while Jamal Carter sat near the front, shoulders squared, his expression alive with determination. Karen Whitaker sat further back, hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture small but her eyes fixed intently on Marcus, carrying the weight of regret and the hope of redemption. Off to the side, leaning casually against the wall, Victor Hayes stood with his arms folded, his sharp gray eyes observing silently, his composure giving away nothing, though Marcus could feel the restrained tension simmering beneath his stillness. The room fell into complete silence as Marcus stepped forward, his voice deep and even, carrying a quiet authority that made everyone lean in instinctively. "This," he began firmly, his tone measured and resolute, "is the start of a new chapter for Elite Autos. I didn't buy this dealership to keep doing things the way they've always been done. I bought it to raise the standard, for the cars we sell, the service we provide, and the values we stand for." He glanced briefly toward Elena, who tapped her tablet and brought up a display behind him showing the dealership's updated service metrics and performance goals, a visual reminder that the change wasn't just talk, it had already begun. "From today forward," Marcus continued, his voice tightening with conviction, "every single person who walks through these doors will be treated with the same respect and attention. No exceptions, whether they're buying their third Lamborghini or stepping into a luxury showroom for the very first time. They will leave here feeling valued. That's how we build loyalty. That's how we win." A ripple of murmurs moved across the room. Quiet, but thoughtful. And Jamal spoke up, his voice steady and sincere. Yesterday, a couple came in asking about financing options, he said, his tone respectful. Before, they probably would have been brushed off. But I sat with them, walked them through everything, and they left saying they'd be back. That's the kind of place we should be. Marcus nodded approvingly, a faint smile flickering across his face. Exactly, he said, his voice deepening with pride. Service builds trust, and trust builds relationships. That's how we grow, and that's how we lead. His gaze shifted deliberately toward Victor, holding his eyes with quiet intensity. Victor, Marcus said evenly, his tone neither sharp nor soft, but undeniably firm. You've spent 20 years shaping this dealership's image, and I respect the work you've put in. But going forward, we're not just selling luxury cars. We're building a reputation for how we treat people. That's the real brand. Victor hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly, his pride flashing briefly in his gray eyes before he finally spoke, his voice low, measured. I'll follow your lead, he said carefully, choosing his words with precision. But you need to understand that our clients expect exclusivity. Change too much, too fast, and we risk losing them. Marcus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the concern without conceding. We're not lowering the bar, he said calmly. We're raising it. Excellence and respect aren't opposites. They work together. A dealership can be elite without being arrogant. And if any client has a problem with that, they're not the kind of client we want. The quiet strength in his tone left little room for argument, and Victor's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence speaking louder than any reply. Elena stepped forward then, her voice crisp and clear as she took over seamlessly. Starting this month, she announced, gesturing to the display. Customer satisfaction will be tracked in real time. Bonuses, promotions, and opportunities for advancement will now depend on service quality just as much as sales numbers. That's the standard moving forward. Several employees shifted in their seats, some nodding subtly, others exchanging glances, absorbing the magnitude of the shift. Karen raised her hand hesitantly, her voice soft but steady when Marcus nodded toward her. I know I made mistakes, she said quietly, her tone carrying genuine remorse. But I've started reaching out to clients I ignored before, and yesterday one of them came back. I want to earn back trust, yours, the team's, and the customers. I'm committed to doing better. Marcus studied her for a long moment before giving a single, measured nod. Actions matter. Karen, he said evenly, his voice steady but not unkind. Keep showing me you mean it, and you'll have my support. She nodded quickly, relief flickering across her face, and Jamal shot her a quiet look of encouragement, a subtle gesture of solidarity. Marcus turned back to address the entire team, his energy shifting, his voice carrying a rhythm now, deliberate and inspiring. Elite Autos will become a benchmark, he declared, his words resonating in the silent room. Other dealerships will look to us and wonder how we do it, and the answer will be simple. We respect people, we serve people, and we deliver excellence every single time. A few employees began to clap softly, hesitant at first. But then the sound grew, filling the showroom with cautious optimism. Marcus allowed it for a moment before lifting his hand to quiet the room, his voice lowering but sharpening as his final words carried across the team like a promise. Change isn't easy, he said steadily, scanning every face in front of him. And not everyone here will choose to make it. But this is where we're going. Elite Autos will lead by example, not just in what we sell, but in who we are. That's our new standard. That's our future. The room fell silent again, but it wasn't the uneasy quiet of the past. This silence carried weight, purpose, and possibility. Jamal sat straighter, his expression filled with hope. Karen's eyes glistened faintly with determination. Elena's poised confidence never wavered, and even Victor, though silent and guarded, lowered his gaze briefly, absorbing more than he would admit. As the meeting ended and the employees began dispersing across the pristine showroom floor, Marcus stepped toward the towering glass windows overlooking the bustling Miami streets below, his reflection framed by rows of shimmering cars behind him. For years, Elite Autos had thrived on image and exclusivity, but starting today, it would stand for something greater, not just luxury, but leadership, not just profit, but purpose. And as Marcus watched his team take their first steps into this new era, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't just about running a dealership anymore. This was about building a legacy. And that legacy had only just begun. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to support the channel.